I'd like to welcome the Honourable Dr Peter Phelps, Member of the New South Wales Legislative Council. Thank you for talking with us today. The committee has received your submission as submission 24. For the Hansard record, could you please state your full name and the capacity in which you're appearing today?
My full name is Peter Robert Phelps, and I'm appearing in a private capacity. I don't purport to represent the Liberal Party of New South Wales or the New South Wales Parliament. However, I believe that my experiences in the state and federal level can offer some insight to the committee.
Yes, indeed. I noted your submission and thank you for providing that. Would you like to make a brief opening statement and we'll move to questions after that?
Chair, I strongly dislike opening statements because it takes away the time of reasonable interrogative questioning from members. So fire away.
Okay, thank you. Senator Hitch, we might start with you if that's okay. Senator Hitch?
Sorry?
We can start with you if that's
no,
okay.
I'm fine. I'm fine.
You okay? Senator Cushing-Moore?
Thanks, Chair. Dr Phelps, thank you for coming today. I wanted to go to one of the strong themes in your submission, and that was that parliamentarians' entitlements should not fall within the remit of a National Integrity Commission unless the advice around entitlements is legally binding. Now, you may be aware that at the federal level we have the Independent Parliamentary Expenses Authority that's been set up now. In your view, does the fact that we have this body remove the need for entitlements to fall under the purview of a National Integrity Commission? Should one be established in the future?
My first statement on the IPA is, has it been legislated for? Or is it simply an executive body? If it's simply an executive body, then what you're doing is merely recreating the sort of advice giving which was formerly given by the Ministerial and Parliamentary Services of the Department of Finance. So if you're simply replicating a body to provide advice without any level of surety as to the legal veracity of that advice, then I don't see why you would do it other than simply as a political exercise to try and be seen to be doing something. If the organisation is set up via executive power, in other words through a non-statutory mean, then you also face the problem that what credence can be given to any advice provided to members from that body. For example, you, Senator, call up and say, hi, I've got this entitlement and I'd like to do this with it. And the IPEA says, well, yes, you can do it. And then subsequently DPP or someone else decides that you can't, then what efficacy can you place in the advice which you've been provided? And you take it to the courts and you say, well, I've got this piece of paper from the IPEA saying everything's fine and hunky-dory, and the courts will tell you in no uncertain terms that the role of statutory interpretation is one which is exclusively reserved for them, and they will strike it down. So my view is that IPEA, if it can provide reasonable and binding advice for members of Parliament, is probably a good idea. Good luck to them in trying to create that advice, but if it can be done, then that's probably a good idea. And in that respect, and for those reasons, I think it's probably best if MPs' entitlements were excluded from any national integrity or corruption body.
In New South Wales, there's an ethics advisor, is that right? Can you just tell the committee a little bit more about the ethics advisor's roles and who can actually seek advice from this person?
Certainly. The ethics advisor in the New South Wales Parliament is the former clerk of the Legislative Council at the current time, and, for example, a member of Parliament such as myself who has an ethical issue in relation to entitlements, or indeed any ethical issue, can call up the ethics advisor, or sorry, not call up, that has to be in writing, so I would send them a confidential email or confidential letter asking for the advice from them as to the ethics of a particular course of action or what I should do in a particular circumstance, and they will provide that. But again, there's no surety to that, it has no legal standing. If ICAC were to then make a subsequent investigation and I were to wave around the advice from the ethics advisor, it has no legal effect.
Okay. So a person who has sought the advice from the advisor, are they able to, they can disclose that advice to anybody they want?
Yes, it's a discretion on the part of the person receiving the advice. The ethics advisor does not release that information. And the ethics advisor makes a once-a-year trip to see privileges committees. Well, I'm on the Upper House Privileges Committee in the New South Wales Legislative Council, and gives us a rundown of what he's been doing over the past year.
Okay. So the advice that's provided, can that ever be accessed by anybody else except for the person it was given to? No. So you couldn't submit an FOI request for it?
It's called a GIPA in New South Wales, but the equivalent is an FOI. It's not FOIable, either my question or the response from the ethics advisor.
Okay, thank you. I might have some more questions later, but that's it for me right now. Thanks.
Senator Hinch.
Nice to catch up with you again. You mentioned the ethics advisor in New South Wales. We actually at the committee interviewed the integrity commissioner in Queensland, who has, I think, probably even far more power or more influence than the ethics advisor in New South Wales. Would that be fair, do you think?
I'm not aware of the Queensland situation.
Well, what they do there is that anybody, any senator or lower chamber person or a public servant can in writing approach the integrity commissioner and ask for advice, saying, are these entitlements legal? Should I do this? Should I not accept this? Should I do this? And he writes back to them in confidence, and it doesn't become any part of any legal matter, and unless, of course, they dismiss his advice and go ahead and take the money. Is that what the ethics advisor sort of does in New South Wales?
You can certainly do that in New South Wales, but again, you face the same problem, and that is that where do MPs' entitlements come from? They come from 4 different heads of powers, all of which are essentially statutory in nature, apart from the sort of wave the wand ministerial discretion which is provided the Prime Minister in relation to staff and a number of other limited matters. But essentially they're all statutory provisions which allow for the payment of entitlements. So you can have as many advisors as you like, you can have as many executive agencies as you like, but when push comes to shove, as we found in Peter Slipper's appeal case, that the role of interpreting the meaning of the words in any entitlements legislation or regulation rests with the courts. That is the fundamental point which came out of the Slipper case. And yes, you can have some sort of, you can make an argument, you wave the piece of paper around and seek some sort of mitigation, but that doesn't devolve from the responsibility of the courts to be the official interpreters of what a legislative enactment or regulation means, what those words mean on paper. The only way you could get around it would be were Parliament to make it clear through an enactment that any advisor, but even then you face the problem that founding legislation would likely to be struck down because you're creating a quasi-judicial authority in the executive. The only thing you could do would be to say that any advice provided by the advisor must be taken into account by the DPP before any prosecution is undertaken, effectively putting a stop order on DPP prosecutions should the member have received the advice from this executive agency. But there's no way you can do it without the almost certain probability that the creation of an executive agency which purported to make quasi-judicial decisions would be absolutely struck down by the courts.
Mr. Phelps, it's very brave for a politician to come before a committee like this and argue that an
well,
ICAC...
You can see, I'm here with every other politician who's made a submission to this inquiry.
To argue that an ICAC should not investigate entitlements, I say it's brave, because how else would we find it out? If the entitlements involve corruption, how can we...
Well, I'm not sure entitlements involve corruption because there's no entitlement that federal members of parliament receive which is fungible for cash. Sure, you might have personal use in relation to travel, but there's no entitlement that you can receive which is fungible for cash. And the argument is that we never found anything. Well, that's completely untrue. In the 7 years I was Chief of Staff to the Special Minister of State, there are multiple instances of people, members of Parliament, who had misused their entitlements. Normally, not maliciously, normally because the entitlements regime is so opaque and so contradictory and so confusing that members and senators made honest mistakes believing that they could do this. Oh, why did you do that? And I would ring them up and say, why did you do this? I said, oh, well, we were in members' dining room and one of my mates said you could do this. And I go, well, that's probably not the greatest source of information. It got to the stage where around about 2001, John Faulkner and my then boss, Senator Abetz, after a particularly heated estimates hearing, said, well, look, can we get some sort of agreement on what is and what is not, what is inside and what is outside the use of entitlements. So George Thompson, who was Faulkner's Chief of Staff, and I sat down for literally 6 months and we went through and said, is this in? Is this out? Is this in? Is this out? We got to the stage where we came to an agreement as to what was in and what was not out, and it was basically a very good working arrangement which paid account of reasonable public expectation on the use of entitlements. Now, of course, unfortunately, Slipper's appeal has blown all of that out of the water, because now you've got to a situation where those conventional agreements are essentially defunct.
Well, Senator Kokoschky-Moore and I last year went to Senate School,
Yep.
and we had a session. Oh, sorry, sorry, Senator Watt. And we were given a large amount of time on what will pass the pub test. And I thought the advice we got from Rosemary Lang was very was astute. And if you stick by it, you keep your nose clean. And that must apply in all parliaments. You must all be told what you can do and what you can't do. And the Choppergate is out of the things like that are out of the question.
Why is it out of the question? It was legally within entitlement. It might have been outside the moral bounds, but that's a matter for the Parliamentary Remuneration Tribunal.
Well, that's for your own
to fix
conscience, isn't it? If you go to a Liberal Party function and hire a chopper at the taxpayer's expense.
No, the point is that, and this has always been the convention, is that ministerial entitlements mean essentially anything a minister is doing, because you don't stop being a minister. If you're buttonholed if you're the Minister for Defence and you go to a function which is essentially private, it could be a wedding, you could well be buttoned on why the F-35 is such a crappy fighter. You don't stop being a minister, and that's the way it's always been done under Labor and Liberal governments. You have a series of parliamentary, electorate and official business, and we had these understood conventions which related to it. And I'll give you a perfect example on this, and that is I was travelling up to Sydney for a function, and so I decided to tweet that I was travelling up to Sydney. Should I go to this function and should I be paid travel for my cost to Sydney? And I literally had 72 hours, only constrained by the fact that I had to sleep, of people arguing with me about what constitutes travel on parliamentary business. Because there is no pub test, because everyone will have a different view, because everyone has a different idea about what the role of members and senators are, because everyone has a different idea about what members and senators should be doing within that role. If you're going to open up a pub test, what you'll get is a situation where members and senators will have no entitlements whatsoever, because quite frankly there are people out there who wouldn't give you a Vegemite sandwich on the public purse because they just hate MPs.
Fair point. That's why I stopped going to football games.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, and just getting back to your comment about going to Senator School, my first contact with ICAC came when I went to the equivalent of Senator School in the Legislative Council, and we were also told about our entitlements. And the regime we have there is particularly bizarre. So you have our entitlements are set by the State Remuneration Tribunal, an executive body, administered by Department of Parliamentary Services, a legislative body, open to, subject to use within a code of conduct, which was a legislative enactment, able to be sought advice on by the Parliamentary Ethics Advisor, which was a legislative creation, but able also to be, my use of entitlements also able to be assessed by the ICAC, which is an executive agency. And from not one of those bodies could I get declaratory statements in relation to what I could definitely or definitely not use my entitlements for. So I go along through this wonderful series of organisations, all of whom are happy to give me advice, none of which I can actually rely on, because the ICAC, like courts in Australia, won't make statements of a prospective nature. I can be taken to court and found not guilty of misusing my entitlements. I can be taken to ICAC and be found not guilty of misusing my entitlements, but I can't receive any proactive assessment beforehand as to whether my entitlements are inside or outside with any legal certainty whatsoever. And sadly, it's the same for all of you. It's the same for all of you, which is why the federal system works so much better. You would call up finance, or you call up me in the SMOS office and say, can I do this? I would say, or finance would say, look, yes, that's definitely, we've got conventional usage indicates that that's fine. And someone complains about it. One of the members in your electorate says, I saw Senator Hinch doing this and it was outrageous and he shouldn't be allowed to do it. Complaint goes to finance. Finance goes, thanks very much for the complaint. We've investigated it. We don't feel the need to take this any further. And that was a sensible way of doing things. Why? Because the advice givers effectively stood as gatekeepers to prosecutorial action at a later stage.
Now, I know you talk about your submission about private hearings versus public hearings.
Yep.
I'm interested in your comments. I've mentioned this before. Senator Cameron was called in as a witness
Oh, yeah, I remember.
at ICAC.
It was on the front page of the telly.
And he made the front page of the telly for 3 days
Yeah.
as if he was a defendant. Now, where do you go from there?
My view has strongly been that if you're going to have an anti-corruption body, it should hold all of its committee hearings in private. And it pains me, you don't know how much it pains me to say this, but Jay Weatherill got it absolutely right. Jay Weatherill got it absolutely right. When the second reading speech for the South Australian ICAC came in on the 31st of May, he said, or the second reading speech says, investigations into corruption conducted by the ICAC will be conducted in private. This is because persons under investigation by the ICAC have not been charged with any criminal offence. To make an investigation undertaken by the ICAC into corruption public would prematurely and unnecessarily prejudice the reputation of a person or persons who may or may not end up being charged with any offence. That is absolutely right. And what you have in New South Wales is nothing more than a legalised defamation of character. The New South Wales ICAC is a disgrace. And it's not merely a disgrace because of the personnel that have been involved in investigations to date. It's a disgrace because it has institutional, structural problems which cannot be undone without a major reformation of that organisation. And if you'd like to, I can list some of these structural problems. And if you do go down the path of having a Federal Integrity Commission or an ICAC, these are things which you should be very, very sure to guard against happening in any organisation like that. Now, would you like me to go through the problems of the state ICAC?
I'd like that, actually.
Okay. First of all, the nature of the remit is far too broad. If you go to Part 3, corrupt conduct, and Section 8, general nature of corrupt conduct, you've got the usual things: official misconduct, breach of trust, fraud of office, fine, bribery, blackmail, blah, 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 blah. Election fraud offences, election funding offences, treating, tax evasion, revenue evasion, currency violations, illegal drug dealing. So, if I'm growing half a dozen marijuana plants in my backyard in Queanbeyan and bag up a quarter ounce of finest head and give them to Senator Watt and he gives me $50, that's officially corruption in New South Wales.
For the record.
And I just make it clear.
Not with New South
What
Wales.
are you talking about?
I do not actually have any
things.
marijuana plants in my backyard in Queanbeyan.
Not with New South Wales marijuana.
The point is, Senator Watt, what we have done is illegal, but it's not corruption. It's not corruption in any meaningful sense. Corruption is me going to Senator Watt and saying, here's 500,000 in unmarked bills. I want you to cross the floor and vote against or vote for the government's motion in such and such, or vote for a particular act. And that's why I disagree with Senator Smith. It's not whether it's done in the open or done secretly. The nature of corruption is the material benefit which accrues to a person because of their particular position. That's the nature of corruption. That's the nature of corruption. Corruption is when you go to someone and they receive a material benefit for doing something which they wouldn't normally do, in return for some sort of benefit to themselves, to their family, to partners or whatever. That's the nature of corruption. It's not calling someone on the phone and giving them advice after a car accident. That is not corruption. It's not corruption in any way, shape or form that would be understood by a person, if you were to take Senator Hinch's pub test. Corruption is a very narrowly defined, in my view.
The Canadian thing should never have been investigated, is that what you say?
That's my view, absolutely. And ICAC vastly overstretched itself going for it. But why? Because there's another problem, and that is ICAC became headhunters. Nietzsche famously said, if you battle monsters, be careful not to become a monster yourself. And the problem with ICAC and other investigative bodies like this is that they develop a cohort of individuals who become obsessed. And there's a reason that if you go and speak to police organisations, they don't have people working in internal affairs for too long. Why? Because if you're dealing every day with corrupt coppers, all you begin to see are corrupt coppers, and therefore all coppers are corrupt. And what you have in ICAC and a number of other crime bodies is that without a regular rotation of people through them, you get people who believe that there is corruption everywhere. And you get internally your own what's called noble cause corruption. I know Senator Hinch is corrupt, and therefore I'm going to find evidence to get him, to prove that he's corrupt. And you say, well, that's a bit extreme, Peter, but that's exactly what happened in the Murray-Keir case.
Well, this actually has been raised at the previous hearings about
sorry, I haven't
the need,
I haven't looked
the
at
need
any
for
testimony,
rotation of staff becomes very important.
Exactly, because otherwise, as I said, because if the only dealings you have are with corrupt officials, then you come to believe that every official is
not corrupt. Can we just add that in there for a minute?
But I mean, that's the other thing which I'd say, that you need to have a regular rotation of people through an organisation, or else you get investigators who do nothing but find corrupt people and then come to believe that everyone is corrupt. And then they will find someone and say, well, let's backfill the evidence. And there's no worse example of this than what happened to Mike Gallagher in New South Wales. And I won't go into the full Mike Gallagher thing, but I spent because it's 20 minutes long and I don't want to take up your time, but if anyone's interested, they can have a look at my speech in the Legislative Council on the 24th of May 2017, where I go through the 4 items, the 4 pillars which ICAC used to besmirch Gallagher, and I demolish each and every one of them. You know, they're 4 pillars, but I actually prefer to think of them as 4 nails which crucified an innocent man. Those 4 pillars which they used to go after Gallagher were absolutely bull, and they were done because, unfortunately, the people involved there decided that they wanted a scalp. And that's one of the problems. One of the problems with this is that they live, their educative purpose is largely done through what might be called public exposure. And it works on this principle, and I said that in my submission, and that is, you or I, Senator Watt or Senator Smith, or any of your senators, we would be horrified to be thought of as being corrupt. You know, our family, our friends, our party members would just be terrible. It would be devastating for us to be known as corrupt. But sadly, there are people in politics who go, I don't give a stuff. Or alternatively, there are people in administration who go, you can call me corrupt, but if I'm going to make $4 million out of this dodgy deal, then, you know, I'll be crying in my luxury mansion in Mossman. There are people for whom the idea that the public exposure of corruption is enough to deter corruption in people, it just simply does not work. And that's my argument. You've got a bad situation in New South Wales which works on the basis that we will expose corruption even if, because of Section 38, the ability to say, you know, anything I say can't be used against me in a court of law later. If you pull Section 38, and as long as you tell the truth, you can say, yep, I took $4 million in bribes for changing my voting patterns. And nothing can be done. Of course, you haven't lied to ICAC, and the testimony which you've given cannot be used in a subsequent criminal prosecution. And I presume that Australia, well, I'm not a lawyer, I'm just an innocent bystander, that there's a similar sort of the fruit of the poison tree, which means that you can't then sort of say, well, because he said he took $4 million in corrupt takings, that we'll go and do an investigation based on that information. So essentially, if you are horrendously corrupt and tell the truth, there'll be nothing which happens to you. No statutory, no legal consequence to what you've done. Whereas if you're just like Senator Cameron, and I make it clear, I have no great love for Senator Cameron, but if you go, even my level of schadenfreude was outraged by Senator Cameron having to walk the media gauntlet into ICAC to essentially say, basically, Ian McDonald was a dodgy crook. We always knew he was a dodgy crook, and we're sorry that Labor left had anything to do with him ever. Now, Senator Cameron has done the right thing, but you know what? He's appeared on the front page of the paper as going to ICAC, and in people's minds in New South Wales, because it's headed by a judge, people think, oh, and they make findings of, oh, the corrupt conduct was undertaken. Well, it must be judicial proceedings, therefore they must be corrupt. That's the other problem which you have with public proceedings, the misapprehension that this actually has a judicial role.
I just one more quick question. How much, you mentioned the Cameron and the Telegraph, and he was hurt by that,
but it's not Doug, it's everyone who goes there.
Okay, how much was the media involved, do you think, in the removal of the Premier over the Grange, Bottler Grange?
Premier made a mistake. He made an error of judgment, and he misled the media. Whether that's an offence, I have to say, Barry was very much a parliamentarian. He very much had a great deal of respect for Parliament, and he would never lie to Parliament or else he'd go, and he had that same sort of attitude towards the media. I told the media something, it was clearly wrong, I thought it was right, and he went. So the media, I mean, it's not the media's fault that Barry forgot that he received a bottle of Grange. Barry forgot he received a bottle of Grange, made an unequivocal statement, and then decided to go. I think that's a fairly honourable thing to do on his part, but, you know, that's right. He did it. But as I said, there's a whole lot of structural problems. You've got the remit, the faulty principle, the idea of regular meetings of ICAC, so that, you know, you have this literally a show trial, which, although it doesn't have a statutory basis, I think they try to aim for about, you know, 10 times a year they'll have major public trials. You've got an ICAC where there's no effective cross-examination, so you can't have an interrogative. You can ask me tougher questions than counsel for one of the people at ICAC.
Yeah, that is true.
So you've got no cross-examination, you've got noble cause corruption, and you've got the get-out-of-jail-free card of Section 38 of the Act. So all of these major structural problems would still exist even if you didn't have a bunch of horrible people who were headhunters and went after people unjustifiably.
And as Senator Kokoschki-Moore has said, we've heard at earlier hearings that it's deliberately set up as a courtroom and Your Honour, etc., etc. So it has all the trappings of a serious court.
Well, that's the other thing I would say. If you're going to have it, you don't need a lawyer, you don't need a judge, you need a forensic auditor. Don't put a judge in charge of an anti-corruption body. Put a forensic auditor in. I'm sure that there's someone in finance or auditor generals, or even if you went to the private sector and grabbed someone from there, get a forensic auditor, because they're far more likely to be able to understand the minutiae of institutionalised and systemic corruption within the public service, you know, through the awarding of tenders or whatever you might have, than a judge would and than a lawyer would.
Senator Kokoschki-Moore?
Thanks, Chair. Just going back to the issue of public hearings,
Yep.
We haven't spoken about public reporting. So in South Australia, we have a situation where hearings are in private and the Commissioner's reports are private. What are your views on that? Should there be at least some degree of publicity around the work and the findings of an independent commission against corruption?
My view is simply this, you should have it entirely in private, and any evidence adduced from that, including evidence from compellable self-incrimination, should then be allowed to be used by the DPP in subsequent legal actions. Now, I know Senator Smith is going to get upset by my view on this, but I do believe that we should be subject to a higher standard. No one forced Senator Collins to become a senator. No one forced me to become a member of the Legislative Council. We did it of our own free will. No one forces people to become ministers or parliamentary secretaries or junior ministers. With great power comes great responsibility and the need to account for that responsibility. No one forces someone to be a departmental secretary or assistant departmental secretary. They do that because they want to, and with that comes a great deal of power. And with great power comes great responsibility. And if you're not prepared to have a greater level of scrutiny placed upon you than, Jim and Jill's string bag from Mount Druitt, then you shouldn't be in politics. You shouldn't be in politics.
So what is it that we disagree on?
Well, I believe that that it should be, if you're going to have, and that's a big if, and I'll speak a little bit more about whether you actually want a federal one. I say that you should have one in there, but I only say that based on a very certain and narrow perspective. Mm-hmm. If you're going to have an anti-corruption commission or an integrity commission, and let's make it clear, Senator, whatever you call it, it's going to be looked on as a federal ICAC. And there will always be mission creep from people within it who want to expand their powers. There is no government agency which doesn't believe that with a bit more power or a bit more regulation or a bit more resource or a bit more money, they couldn't do much, much more. So whether you call it an integrity commission or whatever, it's inevitably going to work its way through either media pressure or political pressure within the parliament or pressure from the bureaucrats themselves towards an anti-corruption commission. So the name is quite irrelevant. If you're going to have one of those things, it should be an inquisitorial body. It should be held, everything should be held in camera. It should be able to compel testimony, including self-incrimination. It should have no prosecutorial power. It should have no finding power. but all the evidence adduced, including compulsorily acquired self-incrimination, should be available for the DPP and should be usable in court. And that's my view.
We've been told through other hearings that one of the benefits of public hearings is that it acts as an alert to the public or people who might have information that could help inform the ICAC in its investigation of a particular matter. How, if you are only holding private hearings, how then could you benefit from people coming forward that would have information that might not otherwise be aware of that
investigation? It's a good question. There's a two-strap stream to that. Firstly, I don't deny the importance and efficacy of an anti-corruption body with its educative power within members of parliament, but also within the broader public service. I think that's fine. That goes. The best educative example is sending someone to jail. You know what? Sending someone to jail beats every, half-day session on integrity. If you know someone has gone to jail because they've allowed for acceptance of corrupt, because of corrupt dealings in a procurement project, you know what? They have a hell of a lot of government officials who are going to go, well, we saw what happened to Jane. She ended up 3 years in women's prison for taking those bribes. There's what did Voltaire say? The British shoot admirals every now and again to encourage the others. Going to jail is a pretty good encouragement not to be corrupt. And the great thing about it is that if you have a system like I'm suggesting, you can use that evidence adduced in a proper criminal corruption proceeding in the criminal court, which will be in public, where all the evidence will be displayed, where the role of that Integrity Commission has been vital in producing that evidence, and that's the way you get the educative effect across. And instead, what you've got in New South Wales is, in fact, the worst situation. The worst situation. The Murray-Keir case is a perfect example where they had their meeting. They had their meetings of ICAC in public, and Keir was defamed as this horrible, corrupt person. And thank God the DPP actually took him for a criminal matter, because at that criminal matter he was able to prove his innocence. Because there's a reverse onus of proof in this situation. He proved that he was innocent. Moreover, and it's worthwhile having a look at this, what was said about the ICAC at the time by that, and I've lost my sheet of paper. But basically they said the ICAC deliberately withheld evidence, did a very bad investigation and was misleading. So I think that the criminal courts in that instance did the exact opposite of what a good ICAC should do, and that is they basically said you've got the dodgiest, worst procedures you could possibly have, and essentially we're throwing this case out. Here it is, I found it. Mr Keir was exonerated in the criminal court by Magistrate Greg Grogan, who found ICAC had conducted its investigation in, quote, an unreasonable and improper manner, unquote, and that the, quote, proceedings were initiated without reasonable cause, unquote, and the investigators, quote, withheld relevant evidence, unquote. Now that's a bad situation to occur.
And so there's no repercussions, legal repercussions for that commission withholding information from the DPP?
Well, there would be, except for the fact that, and this is where your committee is so important, what you do is, and I'm going to talk about big P politics, if the major parties come to the conclusion and that you have a unanimous recommendation from this committee that you don't need a federal ICAC or a federal, then you've got, I think that's a fairly decent outcome. Now that's entirely up to you, and that's based on your own assessment of the ability of the existing arrangements to uncover and prosecute corruption at a federal level, which I suspect would be quite small, from my own dealings with officials and with members of parliament. However, there's always the political incentive to say, no, let's go for we're going to have a federal ICAC. At which point the body, the political party which opposes it immediately becomes labelled as, what have you got to hide? Why don't you want a federal ICAC? Why are you covering up for corruption? So if you'll excuse the metaphor, both major political parties have a gun at each other's head, and the first person to pull the trigger gets the media acclaim. And that's the problem we face in New South Wales. Everyone knows what's wrong with ICAC. And although I don't purport to speak for anyone, I can say that the overwhelming majority of my colleagues on the coalition know exactly what's wrong with ICAC, and a significant number of Labor members, and I do not purport to speak for Labor members, but the discussions I've had, a significant number of Labor members know what's wrong with the structural problems of ICAC at the moment. But the problem is there's no political incentive to make the relevant changes which we need to turn the ICAC in New South Wales into a proper investigative organisation, because the immediate response will be from the Herald, oh, politicians are getting together in a cosy little deal to cover up corruption. And that's the problem which we face. And that's a problem which you, as members of the federal parliament, before you think about creating this, have to weigh up. Do you have enough federal anti-corruption organisations at present? Do they fill the gaps? Is there a level of corruption in the federal sphere which necessitates the creation of a new body, or can the existing bodies handle that? That's something which I have no experience in at the current time, and which you can seek evidence of, even evidence of an in-camera nature from the relevant federal crime organisations. But it's something which you must keep in the back of your mind, or else you'll find yourselves going down the same path which New South Wales unfortunately went down.
Senator Smith?
Thanks, Your Chair. So I'm still confused, Mr Phelps. What is it that we disagree on?
Oh, I don't know.
Okay.
It's so rare that we disagree.
That's
Dean.
cleared that up. That's cleared that up. Okay, thanks very much.
It just comes down to the issue of the public versus private, which you mentioned with the Law Council earlier, and that is, yes, should an unfairer test be applied to members of Parliament and senior bureaucrats? The answer, in my view, is yes. Why? Because the material power which we have, and even more so at an executive level, is such that it demands a higher level of accountability and responsibility.
Yes, absolutely.
Jill and Jane Stringbag can't enter into a $25 billion defence procurement project.
Record, I'm firmly in the camp that says that parliamentarians should be put under higher levels of public scrutiny. Because there's no shortage of people in our community or in political parties who would like to be parliamentarians. So it's not as if we have a short list of people. You know, there's an abundant people who could probably, are interested, would probably do it better than many of us here. So the idea that we can't have higher levels of transparency and accountability on parliamentarians is outrageous.
But it should be done in the context where that you're not defamed by mere association with the body who's investigating.
And in regards to this inquiry thus far, the preservation of criminal justice principles, which have served people very, very well, not just in our country but in other countries, needs to be preserved. And when I hear people talk about the failings of ICAC, it's exactly because those criminal justice principles haven't been preserved, and this institution has been allowed to be established, which people think is a court, and it mimics a court, and it's absolutely not. And I'm surprised that New South Wales parliamentarians aren't yelling more about this.
No, because no one wants to be seen as...
It's not a debating chamber.
I agree with that, and the reason it is simply because everyone is scared that if you confront ICAC and the structural problems which ICAC has, is you're just seen to be soft on corruption. You're soft on corruption. See, well, I will say one thing, Senator Collins, and that is, you know what the federal sphere has? It's got estimates.
Yes.
When I went to the state parliament, I said, "Oh, what's your estimates process like?" And they say, "Oh, it goes for about a week." I say, "Yeah, what about additional estimates?" "Oh, only if they're needed." "And what about additional supplementary estimates?" We don't have those." "Oh, okay, so over the week, how long do you have to interrogate ministers?" "Well, normally each minister would have about 2 hours." Oh, that's really short, because I remember sitting, behind Senator Abetz, having to fend off Senator Ray and Senator Faulkner for like 11 hours at a stretch. Oh yeah, okay, so 2 hours. Oh yeah, but you've got to remember that 1/3 of the time is specifically allocated to the coalition, and they can choose not to use it. Oh, so it goes to the opposition and crossbenchers? No, it's just wiped. So literally, a minister in New South Wales and his officials have 120 minutes divided, 2/3 120 minutes is what? 80 minutes. 80 minutes per annum, not including the time which is taken up in the long-winded self-justificatory speech at the beginning.
An opening statement.
This is the level of integrity which the which the parliament sets for itself. Now, the interesting thing is that the majority in the upper house does not lie with the government. The crossbenchers have simply refused to exercise their power. And interestingly enough, Labor has previously been reticent to actually put forward an estimates program which would challenge the government. And that's one of the things which I have to say about this, may militate against creating a federal ICAC, because you know what, Senator Collins, your estimates committees can just say, right, we're going to do 2 days on this. And you know what? We're going to do an additional hearing, and we're going to do supplementary estimates, and we'll do additional supplementary estimates, and we'll keep probing and digging and digging and digging and digging until we can find out the minutiae of why this contract was awarded, who awarded it, under what condition it was awarded. You can't do that when you've got literally, as a Labor upper house member, 40 minutes once a year. So, 3 cheers for the Senate committee system.
We're in strong agreement.
As you can understand, I'm not
Australian
particularly
Senate, Mr. Phelps.
popular with members of my own ministry for advocating something like this. But the point remains, and that is that the fact that Senate estimates does exist, and you can call up a senator. And when I was in opposition, when I worked for Ronaldson, we would get calls from people saying, maybe you should ask this particular person this particular question. That's fine. If you've got a great press gallery, why does corruption flourish at a local government level? Because there's very little press coverage of it. There's press coverage of the state gallery and the federal gallery. If you were to call up, if you're an official and you were to call up, I don't know, Kyla Lucassian or Shari Markson or Bevan Shields and said, mate, have I got a yarn for you? You've got that. You've also got that outlet. You've got a very professional, not that the New South Wales Press Gallery isn't professional, but it's small and it's overworked. Federal Press Gallery is large and it's also overworked, but it has a greater capacity to do that sort of investigative journalism. You know, why is so much corruption at local government? Because it's done in the dark. No one actually pays too much account to it, especially in the media.
Have you exhausted?
So, we could keep going, but we won't.
No, I'm happy. I'm happy to keep going as well.
Keep going in furious agreement.
But I think my position has been made pretty clear.
No. And thank you for that. The next session we have today with the clerks is directed towards canvassing more clearly the existing parliamentary accountability processes, and estimates, as you say, is the obvious one. So thank you very much, and thank you for your appearance today.
Thanks very much for having me.